Thank you for the lecture. I had a couple questions. It's my personal feeling that there can be a hope. There was on the news a little few weeks ago that there was a aerosol vaccination that was making COVID a bit more workable, and it gave me the idea that if they have that sort of technology available, then maybe by late November, they can start to have a more of a full vaccination to be able to start to hand out. And by next spring, that we can start to be in coordination to try to work out our problems. That's kind of my feeling how things are going to proceed. And I mean, it's a fairly reasonable way to ask how to proceed. And I mean, we should be able to make those sort of demands. With the idea that, by maybe this time next year or next summer, we can be fully out of this COVID within the next year or two. But it is with the idea that it's only a short-term vaccine. I've heard it can only be like a yearly vaccine. So by next flu season, you would have to get a new shot, and that raises a whole bunch of questions: how long it's going to linger, and how we have to prepare ourselves. So it's a nagging thing that it's a big nag. And so I was wondering, out of that, you mentioned very nicely that the stock market itself is doing great, and large corporate persons have big fat dollars they're sitting on right now, and they have a certain reserve. And I'm wondering how that will play out in the next few years, because I'm trying to I'm trying to practice with my local governments of the Bay Area, just what are good practices. And when they say, we've got this big depression coming and we've got all these bills we're going to have to pay, I'm trying to figure out, what do we hold accountable and what do we actually worry about?
Thanks, Jack, for the talk. Really appreciate it. I think wanted to make a comment and then a question. I think you lay out really clearly in terms of when you look at this whole stimulus process, what this whole process has been about is basically just transferring trillions of dollars of wealth in different forms and fashions to corporations and the folks in our economy that don't need it and are actually contributing to all the problems we face. And, I think with this kind of future you've laid out, to me, no help is going to be coming whatsoever. Evictions, wildfires, all these things are on top of one another. And I think only if we rely on ourselves and kind of mass movements similar to what we saw in the George Floyd protests, only something with that force, I think, is going to, get the government in a position where they're actually, give reforms that meet our needs. But I think we need to be going beyond that. This system clearly is it's run in the interests of these corporations, and we need to be thinking, how can we overthrow this system and create a society that meets our needs? So that's the comment I wanted to make. And then the question I had was, one thing you mentioned is how, some of these stimulus bills have not had any money for local and state governments. So what is that going to mean when we're living in cities and states that are completely broke and have no money? What is that going to mean for public transit, for hospitals, for public health spending? Can you give us a little picture there?
I really appreciated how clear you made it, just how ridiculous the economy is set up in general, and how it's obviously not meant to serve the working class or the majority of people. So I guess my question from there is a lot of this conversation is based on this idea of either a recovery of an economy or a severe financial crash, like you explained. And I guess I'm just thinking about is it even worth focusing on this idea of recovery when obviously even in a good economic system, I mean, we have less unemployment. It's obviously a slightly better position for a working class, but, is still clearly there to serve these giant corporations and, this upper capitalist class. So what are things we should be focusing on, which I think Kyle was getting at as well, which is pushing beyond this, and what are the metrics beyond, you know, GDP and these, you know, these types of metrics that we generally use when talking about the economy that really are focused on how working class, I guess, way of life can actually improve and move beyond something where we're just constantly oppressed and taken advantage of. Sorry, that's a big question. Thanks.
Well, first of all, the question of the vaccine, you know, I mean, what you got going on now is multiple attempts to produce a vaccine in different ways, different approaches. And very clearly, the governments, not just in the US, are going to throw something out there as quickly as they can and actually test it with the population. In other words, what would have been normal times, an extended period of testing it, they're going to let us be the guinea pigs, I think, to find out whether it really works. I mean, in Russia, you know, they're doing it right now. They're bypassing all the tests and throwing it out there and see what works. But, you know, when you talk about oral, that's just the delivery system. More important is, will they have a vaccine by you know, November, December? And then just as important, it's pretty clear the U.S. Under this current administration does not consider the organization and the distribution of this. You know, we're going to need hundreds of millions of these, and you know, we can't even produce masks. You know, we got to buy them from Asia and everywhere else around the world still. In other words, it's a totally chaotic non-war economy. You would think that they would be already coming out describing and building the plan for the distribution of this when it was available, but I've heard nothing. And, you know, they'll probably give it to first responders first and give it to other friends, and wealthy folks will find a way to get it. And it's going to be chaos, you know, even if they come up with something soon, which I don't think is going to happen. And, you know, the way Trump answered this morning about the FDA tells me that they're telling him you're not going to get it by the election. So he's already starting to point fingers and blame. As for the stock market and corporations, you know, as I said, they're sitting on trillions of dollars. They had trillions going into this situation, you know, for the last 10 years. Just dividend payouts and stock buybacks, corporations to their shareholders have been over $1 trillion a year on average. $1 trillion for 10 years, right? And under Trump, $3.4 trillion in dividends and stock buybacks have been paid out, and that's only the big corporations. You know, we don't know how much more and how much abroad, right? Trillions and trillions of dollars, and you know, that just tells you who is the real focus of the politicians. And by the way, it's not just Republicans. Democrats played this game too, you know, through Clinton and through Obama and so forth. You know, they threw a few more crumbs to make it look like, but, you know, they're all complicit in this. Every one of them. The Federal Reserve has provided free money virtually for bankers for 30 years, right? So, yeah, stock market's doing well because a massive amount of liquidity, money, liquidity as we call it, has been provided to financial investors and big banks and big corporations and wealthy investors and shadow banks, as we call them. You know, they get all these tax cuts, they get all this subsidies, and they put it into financial markets. They don't invest it into building real things for real people that would require hiring of employees. Now, there's some of that going on. I'm not saying it's, you know, there's none of that, but more and more it's financialization. It's making their trillions by financial speculation. Self-reliance, yes, I think that's a good point. We're going to have to, and people are going to start moving, and now are already trying to take care of themselves. They'll find ways of working together. But, you know, a big part of the problem is resources, which means money. And people can help each other out a lot, but in and of itself, you know, it'll mitigate, but it won't solve the problem that we have. What does the state and local government layoffs mean? You're going to start hearing very soon mass layoffs in the public sector, state and local governments, because they just don't have the revenues. You see, they got to balance their budget. And if they're spending so much more than they were before the crisis, and their tax revenues have collapsed because of businesses and workers aren't working as much, then you have these big, massive deficits at the state and local government level. And that's exactly what we have. That's why the HEROES Act said we needed $900 billion just to keep the state and governments, cities afloat for another 18 months. But, you know, the Republicans and McConnell don't want to do it because I think part of the strategy of Trump and the Republicans is to punish the blue states as much as possible. Punish them politically, you know, send the DHS troopers in, the cities, whenever, and punish them economically, not pass the bills that would the most populous states really need the most. So I think, the refusal to provide any assistance to state and local government is part of this general strategy of punishing the blue states. And then, of course, other services, significant services are going to be cut. And we're going to have problems here, providing pensions and healthcare and so forth. All this is going to occur probably starting fairly soon. Is it worth focusing on trying to do something about it politically and so forth? It's not just a question of GDP. I agree with the question. GDP is really irrelevant, and it's not in many ways accurate either. But it does reflect a certain amount of spending that goes on by households and consumers that is really important to dampen and mitigate the negative effects of what's going on. That doesn't mean you just focus on the mitigation and fighting over budgets and deficits and fighting over spending and stimulus. No, you fight at all levels, but one level, if you don't defend the immediate interests of working folks and small businesses and so forth, you lose all credibility. Most people are focused on the immediacy of their problem, and you got to address the immediacy. At the same time, you don't just address the immediacy, you point out the bigger picture of why there is such a crisis in the immediate, and what really needs to occur to longer term, intermediate and longer term, not keep finding yourself in immediate crises that continue and get worse. So yes and no, it's not futile, and yes, just focusing on GDP is not the question either.
I have a question. I followed Michael Roberts' blog quite a bit. He's a Marxist economist. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. And he kind of talks about the same thing as you, as a W shape going on. And I'm just wondering, you talk about the triple crisis, and I'm wondering what your comments on, he's developing this theory and giving some empirical data lately on Marxist theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that is and how that applies to what's going on right now and these crises that seem to be intensifying.
Yes, as an orthodox Marxist economist, at the center of the cause of everything is the falling rate of profit, according to Michael Roberts. And that comes from passages in volume 2 and 3, unpublished works of Marx's Capital, unpublished, right? Marx experimented with that whole idea that the rate of profit, not the level, the rate of profit, when it declines, it signals a crisis coming, okay? Now, I've always had doubts that it was just caused by the rate of profit, right? And profit in the Marxist sense is always just profit from producing discrete goods. It's not profit from financial assets or financial speculation or anything like that, right? So I guess my position is I take issue with Michael, and I've written to him and written about it, that you just can't use the profit rate, the corporate profit rate, as the indicator. especially when it's only profits from making discrete goods, or goods produced by what Marx calls the productive labor as opposed to non-productive labor. The problem with that approach is that what are corporate profits, right? Certainly you've got to look at profits worldwide because it's a global capitalist economy now. And you can't get good profits data from around the world in many places. You can't even get good profits data here in the US because what's called corporate profits or net income or whatever else you want to call it is distorted by the capitalists themselves. They push money off into all these little cubby holes and they get all the tax cuts and so forth, which raise or lower the profit rate. It's not reliable. It's not the sole I'm suspicious of single explanations of crises, and capitalism has changed fundamentally in the late 21st century. It's more financialized, and the profits from financial speculation cause a lot of the instability and the financial bubbles and the financial instability. Michael doesn't take account of that because he believes, as Marx did, that it's all fictitious capital. It doesn't make any difference. Well, it does destabilize the economy. It does make a difference. When you mortgage bonds and derivatives and all this other stuff crash, it brings down the financial system and the banks don't loan to real businesses and they contract, and now you're in a deep contraction, a great recession or worse. So it does play a role in my view, and I would not totally agree with him, although there is a lot. I guess my position, to sum it up, is that it's not irrelevant what you say. It's necessary to have what you say, Michael, in part of a general explanation, but it's not sufficient. Global capitalism has fundamentally changed, as it always changes rapidly all the time in the 21st century. And you are not wrong, Michael, you're only part right.
Many economists have said that the situation was not good even before the COVID crisis, and we were heading into a recession. So I wonder if you want to touch on that a little bit. What do you think the effect, let's say the Democrats win in November and have both houses of Congress, would they pass a stimulus somewhat like the HEROES Act, perhaps? And if so, what kind of an impact would that have on the economy? It seems to me that the Democrats, as you said, are fundamentally the same as the Republicans in terms of their real interests and goals. However, they do seem to have a different strategy and do seem to take into account more that if you can you totally create mass destitution, you may have a fight back on your hands. So in other words, the Democrats may use a little more carrot and a little less stick than the Republicans. And what impact would that have? You said there's massive amounts of reserves, but then you said by next year there could be a financial crisis because of debts piling up and that kind of stuff. Wouldn't the reserves that the corporations have mitigate that to a certain extent? And if so, how much? And then you also said that you had been a union negotiator. So right now the unions in this country have done very little on this kind of stuff. A lot of workplaces have gone on strike, or at least short strikes, but unions themselves haven't done much. I'm wondering if you think the intensity of the crisis is going to push the unions into more activism. And just to say real quick that it all depends on what people do, how much we fight back.
Every day I'm amazed by kind of the predicament that we're in, especially in, the belly of the beast and the empire. And here we have, the world's largest economy, this, that, and the other thing. And so the situation that we're in, and you mentioned earlier the foreign affairs, that there's some people who, are saying that we're in a Great Depression. But my question to you is in relationship to the war economy. Do you come across many people who kind of represent the capitalist class to a certain extent who want to pivot, towards a so-called war economy? And how considerable kind of like is that view, if it exists? And related to that, how much do you think that the COVID was kind of like an impetus to really reshape the American economy? Consolidation of capital, stuff like that.
I've been wondering about organizing during the coming crisis. By the way, hi, Jack. And I was during a growth phase in the economy, the capitalists seem to be willing to make concessions, but during a falling period, they tend to not do that. And you wonder about how labor is going to react, and how people, since labor is not very organized in unions anymore, how they're going to react. And I came across the comment today, it was by Rosa Luxemburg, where he says the unconscious movement tends to precede the conscious movement. And I'm kind of wondering if you have any sense of whether that's going on, because I've been surprised with COVID, you still see these massive demonstrations, even though you might expect people to not be out in the streets. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what you might anticipate and how we can facilitate movement building during this COVID crisis.
Well, as always, all excellent questions here. Let me see if I can address some of them and try to keep it as brief as I can. Yes, to the first question, I think it was Steve. I did talk about the 2019 economy pre-COVID. My analysis is that the economy was getting very weak, U.S. and globally, even before the impact of COVID, and we should understand the health effect as a precipitation and an acceleration of trends that were already occurring, acceleration of the decline and precipitation of the decline. That's why it went so deep. But if you look at 2019, we were in a 6-month manufacturing recession. There was a global manufacturing recession going on. We had the trade war. So exports and imports were weakening everywhere. U.S. business investment, in plant and structures and so forth, had been contracting for 9 consecutive months, even after Trump's $4 trillion tax cut in 2018. And consumers were still purchasing, but doing more so and getting more overextended on debt, and credit card defaults, which are usually around 3-4%. Were already up by December of last year to 8-9%. So all the signs were there that things were getting extended and weak. And then, of course, here comes COVID, and that just sort of accelerates and precipitated the whole process. If the Democrats win in November, will they reintroduce a HEROES Act? I think there's a big fight going on in the Democratic Party over just that, should they win, and the fight will continue. You got one wing of the Democratic Party that's trying to, spend more and do something about the crisis and stimulate the economy in various ways. But you got another wing, the corporate wing of that party, the DLC, Democratic Leadership Conference faction that runs it now, pretty much already trying to dampen down expectations. This guy Kaufman, who is responsible for already vetting the various people who may be in a Biden administration, already came out and said that, we're going to have these huge deficits. The pantry, as he says, the pantry's going to be bare. We got to, this is the same talk we got when Obama got in, right? The same talk, Larry Summers and others saying, we can't spend that much, and so on and so forth. That's the corporate wing speaking, saying, we can't spend on other folks, that really need it that much. And we'll see the same fight over again. Revenues, they're sitting on trillions of dollars, but, when times are bad, they sit on it. They won't invest it unless they see an opportunity of making more profits and more revenue. So they will be flush, except, of course, businesses and the airlines and travel, and, they're in deep doo-doo. But most of the others, particularly tech companies and so forth, they're in fat city. And if times are bad, they will sit on it. They will not stimulate the economy. It takes government to stimulate the economy. Individually, they'll say, well, gee, we'd like to invest, but, what effect is just me doing that? And if I do that, my shareholders and my board are going to be upset with me. I can't turn this thing around myself. And they'll sit back. That's what they always do. That was the great lesson of John Maynard Keynes in the 30s, that investment in businesses will drive the economy into a depression, but they won't drive it out. Individually, they'll stand pat, and the government has to stimulate the economy. So I think that's really what the situation is there. Should we have, a Democratic administration, or, the reserves, these massive reserves that are there sitting on the sidelines? The second question, second query here, capitalist class, do I know any that want to pivot? No, I don't walk in those groups that much anymore, although I spent a couple of decades in market research at the very high levels here with different startups and technology companies and so forth. So I got to see how they think and how they respond. And I did spend 15 years in the union movement with various different unions as an organizer, the contract negotiator, and strike leader. So I know how workers think too. And I don't think the unions as organizations are going to do very much in this crisis. I just don't see it. There'll be individual, maybe a rank and file local unions that will, as their members really feel the pain. But the big boys up there in Washington, D.C., they are tied into the apron strings of the Democratic Party, and they have less influence than they ever had before. And they'll look for more handouts. They will not take the lead, which is not to say that the workers themselves locally may not take a lead. I think they will, but it won't be as much through their unions. A lot of leftists tend to see the present through the rose-colored glasses of the 1930s. That was quite different. It's not the same here today, in my view, at least. And the third set of questions here, I think, how will the COVID reshape the economy? Significantly. Already we're seeing this massive restructuring going on in the economy, long-term restructuring going on. Businesses, whenever there's a crisis, they learn to do with less, which means squeeze their workers more. Look, even in the rebound, they're bringing people back more part-time, temp basis, lower wages, and so forth. And they're finding, gee, we can function this way. Tech companies, have a lot of people working from home and say, gee, we can function this way, save a lot on facilities costs and so forth. Yeah, let's just continue doing this. A lot of industries are going to, quote, downsize and restructure to try to survive going forward. And then they'll find out that, gee, we can continue doing this. This has always happened in a contraction. Plus, as I've said before in my writings, around the corner is this whole artificial intelligence revolution coming, which is not just a tech revolution. It's a way of exploiting, I believe, the working class even more than has been up to date, because according to the McKinsey consultants, AI by the end of this decade is going to eliminate 30% of all the occupations or reduce the hours of work in occupations. You see, AI is simply massive computing power, accessing massive databases and applying statistical operations, advanced statistical operations to streamline decision-making, simple decision-making. Workers doing simple decision-making in not just manufacturing, but in services will be eliminated, right? They're going to get rid of them, right? We're going to have massive structural layoffs by the end of the decade just because of AI coming on top of all the problems we've got now, on top of the fact we have 50 million people who are contingent, in those part-time tech gig contract workers and low pay as a result. The pressure on the working class economically is going to be severe going forward for the next 10 years. And, I'm optimistic that people aren't going to put up with it, particularly younger people. They're not going to put up with being indentured for life, condemned to low wage, intermittent jobs with no benefits and so forth, can't raise a family. They're not going to put up with it. And they sense this, I think, in the demonstrations that are beginning and the protests that are beginning. They're desperate. And the big problem we have today is where can they go? They go vote for Democrats, like Sanders says, And the great shell game is, if you look at the last 40 years, the great shell game is the Republicans get in, they wreck the economy by making their benefactors richer than ever before. They wreck the economy. set the conditions for the Democrats to come in saying, we're going to do something about it. The Democrats don't really resolve the problem. And to get the support of the powerful corporations and wealthy, they sort of lowball their restructuring and trying to save the economy. They fail in doing what needs to be done. The people see that, and the Republicans then exploit that and come in with even more aggressive takeaways and aggressive subsidization of the corporate elite that's going on. In my just published book this year, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump, I pretty much document what's been going on since 1980 in this sense, and that you got to understand Trump. Trump is an expression economically of trying to engage in even more aggressive and virulent neoliberal policies in order to satisfy that more aggressive wing of the capitalist class that's behind him. After Obama failed. Obama failed to really restore neoliberalism, and that set the pace and the condition for Trump to come in. But I don't believe neoliberal policies can solve the problem here anymore. So what comes this decade is not going to be neoliberalism. It'll either be more progressive or it will be something much worse than neoliberalism. And that's what this decade is going to be about.
I was wondering if you could explain to me or to us, with the economy being in such dire straits at the moment, how is it that yesterday, I believe I read that sales of existing homes went up 25% compared to last month. And I did check with census.gov and stuff to make sure that, it was somewhat true. And the median price of homes being about $300,000. So it doesn't seem like it's, I don't know, millionaires buying these homes, but more like the average person. I don't know. And so I don't understand how these two can be happening at the same time. So I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of insight on that. Thank you.
I farm in the California Central Valley. And I'm kind of, every time I hear the news about the economy, I say, give me more and more better news that U.S. capitalism is finally at its last stages. I want to celebrate. Don't make the battle so hard to tear this system down. So, it's always the issue, like Malcolm X says, is it going to be reform or is it going to be revolution? I think as a worker, I've been a worker all my life, that I know the direction we're going. That's why I listen to, these kind of conversations about socialism. And what I want to know from economists is, given that we know capitalism is collapsing, how can Marxist economists help the working class to fashion strategy and help us to position so they can weaken capitalism even further? I mean, I understand that we got to suffer a whole lot more, and it's true, there's a lot of workers that need to suffer to wake up. But the more suffering, the closer we get. When I speak, in the Filipino community a lot, and I said, listen here, I want to tell you, the darker the sky, the brighter the star. We just have to keep looking at that star, okay? It's going to get dark, it's going to get ugly, and the war that's going to break out in this country is going to be the most ugly, bloodiest, vicious in mankind's history. So let's steel ourselves. Let's get prepared. So I don't care, in terms of let's make this economy better. Let's elect one wing of the ruling class over the other wing of the ruling class. I think it's, I don't think we have time for that anymore, do we?
Thanks again for the talk. Thanks, Mary, for that passion. I think I wouldn't let the Democrats off the hook so easily, even on this post office thing. I mean, there was a bill in Bush that was passed during Bush 2006 where it hugely defunded the post office, something like $65 billion from 2007 to 2016. It was clear that that's what it was going to do. 95% support from Democrats on that bill, including Nancy Pelosi. So as she pretends to be on the side of the post office now, they absolutely were behind that cut then. I think rightfully they're a little nervous that if mail-in voting machines are sorting machines are gone, the votes won't get in. But in no way are they on the side of the post office or postal workers. They'll just as happily get rid of that thing as fast as they can as well. And I think similarly with the idea of an economic stimulus package or recovery, we know exactly what that'll look like under a Biden administration, because we saw what it looked like for 8 years under the Obama administration. I think in this recent period, we've seen sort of a path open up for us that we can't forget, which is when regular people, ordinary people, start to recognize that our future is in our hands and what we do will determine it. That's going to be the only thing that's going to open up the road for some kind of future that's in our interests. I don't think we need to sort of count the pennies or how much more stimulus will we get this way versus which administration. When people are ready to take to the streets and start to organize, that's going to be the only thing that really we have to rely on our own forces. So thank you.
So I'm wondering, and given everything particularly that he said just a few minutes ago about AI and how much employment is going to be shed from the economy, even that was being figured into the next decade, even before COVID. How do you feel about, as a part of a program, as a part of arguing for socialism, as a part of arguing against capitalism, things like minimum income schemes and just wholesale transfers of wealth? The only way I've ever heard this discussed much is in the context of something like reparations for slavery to the Black community. But this is something I'm kind of enamored with, this idea of this, all working class people ought to just get $250,000 as a thing to argue for. I mean, the wealth is there. And particularly in this moment where people are so desperate, there's been this big payout to corporations. What would be the arguments against, saying that, hey, we should just demand direct payments as a temporary thing, obviously not to save capitalism?
This was really fantastic. And I just had a comment, not a question. So there is a major resurgence of not believing in science, or, like you said, the idea that a third of Americans are not going to vaccinate for COVID if and when a vaccine is available. But I do hesitate to say that these people are stupid, because I really do think that there is a good reason to question what is being produced and how it's being produced. Vaccines really take a decade to develop on average. And right now, under the Trump administration, $8 billion has been given to various pharmaceutical companies to produce vaccines. And really, a number of them have never even produced functional vaccines. Even last week, I heard that the Trump administration gave a bunch of money to Kodak, the film company, who's never been in pharmaceuticals. So no doubt, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I do believe that we need a vaccine for this. But the way that they're being produced is, with like a blank check from the government, is not the way to do it safely. So the fear is very real, but it's misplaced, I think. Really it's a systemic problem that we're looking at.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jack. I really appreciate this. And I liked a lot of the comments. I just have one mild disagreement about your characterization of this not being a wartime economy. It is a wartime economy. It's still the class war that's being waged. And unfortunately, right now, it's one-sided. And I think the more that we recognize this and understand, not that you don't, obviously, but it's just language can be important. But the more that we recognize this and convey that idea, the more that people will stop hoping for the Democrats, like people have said. And I appreciate what I think her name was Mary said about the wings of the Capitalist Party. I agree with her. We need to tear both wings off and tear the wings off their two parties. Then we'll start to be able to see what we can really do. The question I have is, obviously, once we see deep movements, really powerful movements, there'll be attempts to buy this off and so on. Do you think there is enough money right now to do this stimulus that you're talking about, $4 trillion or whatever? I'm not saying because we want to stabilize it, but we do need some breathing time after we get mobilized to stay mobilized and cohere our forces. Because it's clear that the one thing that we rarely talk about is the question of massive global warming and climate disruption. We're getting a little taste of that literally in the Bay Area. We're seeing it around the world. This is really not like the 30s. The clock is ticking. It is the ecological zones of this planet that are being jeopardized, the ones that we depend on for our existence. We don't have time to wait. We got to get going.
Okay, housing boomed. How do you explain what's going on? And it's true, it is, the spending and construction and so forth. Well, it's what I said at the beginning. It's a temporary and a long-term effect from the whole crisis. The temporary is you had a bottling up of the housing expenditures, and that's been released here very recently. And you have low interest rates, and you have people who are planning to get out of the urban areas who could afford it. So, you know, we're talking mostly about the well off to do middle class and upper classes and so forth. So yeah, you can have sectors that are doing well while others are doing very, very poorly. I mean, compare that to the airlines or Boeing or something, you know, and it's like black and white. So that's that answer there. As far as our Central Valley guest, I understand your passion too, but action for action's sake without thinking and planning and strategizing is not going to work, you know, and we have to contend for the institutions of power. You cannot avoid that. Just in the street for what? Just to get in the street, or in the street for a purpose? You know, in the street for a purpose and being aggressive to gain control of those institutions of power. I mean, look at what's happened with the radical right and that very aggressive wing of the capitalist class that, you know, the Koch brothers and so forth that are behind Trump. They grabbed and took over a party, the Republican Party. It's the Trump publicans now, right? And some of them, the old line Republicans, are engaged in overtures to the Democrats and vice versa. You know, there will be a party realignment going on here, I think, with a centrist party and, you know, the right-wing Trump publicans, and then a progressive party of some sort that will eventually arise here. And we see some of the early indications of that going on right now. So the organization question is the question. It's the big missing link in this country for people who are really discontent and have nowhere to turn, really, you know. And do you turn to the Democrats? Well, you know, you follow Sanders. Well, Sanders did his trick, didn't he? Well, didn't do it so well because a lot of his supporters aren't going to go, you know, where he asked them to go. The funding, the Postal Service, yeah, that's been going on. Privatized. The Postal Service has been a demand for a long time, and Democrats have fallen into that along with it from time to time. And to some extent, it has been privatized. You know, we took out FedEx and USPS and DHL and all these others. You know, gave them the plum so that making profits, you know, by the Postal Service it becomes more difficult, but it's a public good. I mean, it's not supposed to make profits, you know, but capitalism looks for all the nook and crannies to privatize and to turn into commodity and make money off of, both, you know, within our own country here as well as abroad. It's always looking for ways of making profit, and privatizing public goods and public institutions are one of the many ways that it does so. Wealth distribution, income distribution. Well, you bring up the point. You know, when we talk about these stimulus bills, we're talking about income, aren't we? But the real fundamental change is wealth. You know, wealth is what produces income. You know, owning assets, owning, you know, financial assets and real assets and so forth, you know, businesses, factories and all, that's what throws off the income. And ultimately, you can keep asking for some of the income, a better share of it and so forth. But the problem continues until you publicize the wealth. What we need, I believe, is a series of public investment corporations just run by the government that compete and take over and pretty much leave in the dust, private health insurers, right, who just suck off $1 trillion a year, pushing paper around, don't provide one iota of healthcare services. They just suck off. They're vampires. They're just rentier. We call them rentier capitalists. They don't produce anything. They steal even from other capitalists, right? Those are the guys we should go after, and that's just about the whole banking system, you might say. Anti-science, vaccines, and so forth. Where would we be, perhaps, if we had a public investment corporation in the pharmaceutical business, right? For some time, it was already there, competing with private pharmaceutical companies, right? I think we would already have a vaccine, perhaps. Although, vaccines are very hard to produce. How many real vaccines do we have? Measles, polio, not too many. They're very difficult to actually develop. And it remains to be seen what's going to happen here with a vaccine and whether, the resurgence of COVID in the winter how's that going to interact with the flu season? We don't know. Will these viruses, exchange DNA and become something else? It's going to be with us a long time. It's not going away. Wartime, yes, there's a class war. There's no doubt about it, And even Warren Buffett said years ago, Warren Buffett, the big investor, there's a class war going on, and guess what? My class is winning. I think this was like 15 years ago he said this. They know there's a class war. It's just sometimes workers get confused whether it is or not. But what I'm talking about is that, you've got to organize. When I say a wartime economy, you got to organize it along, war production, not just producing PPE and so forth or incubators by giving it to Ford Motor Company to produce, right? This stuff, was offshored to China and other places because the capitalists could make more money, and they did make more money. And now we're short. We don't have this stuff. And this is only tip of the iceberg of things that we should have. But that's, what free trade gives you. Do we have the money here to do a $4 trillion stimulus? Absolutely. Absolutely. Trump just gave $4 trillion more in tax cuts a couple of years ago, and then $429 billion more in tax cuts last year. And they got $650 billion in tax cuts in March, and he wants even more tax cuts. And not just reversing those tax cuts, but what about a financial transactions tax? If the capitalism is so financialized, you could just put $1 or 10 cents on stock trades. I did an estimate a couple of years ago, a 10-cent tax on every stock trade and $1 for every $1,000 bond trade, and then a penny on every foreign exchange trade, et cetera. Wouldn't affect them at all, hardly. Would produce $400 billion a year. There's $5 trillion a day goes on in foreign exchange transactions. Dollar and foreign exchange, $5 trillion, right? There's $400 trillion in derivatives. The money is there. They're sitting on a lot of it, but the money is there. Foreign tax, right? Defense expenditures, corporate subsidies. If people only knew the massive transfer of income that's been going on. The first book I wrote in 2005 was called The War at Home, The Corporate Offensive from Reagan to Bush. And in it, I purposely went from 1980 to identify just the policies, the shift in the policies, overtime pay and different ways in which workers earn their income and the capitalists earn their income, and how those policies shifted. By 2005, $1 trillion every year. that was in 2005, was being shifted compared to 1980 from wage earners, well, from capital income earners to wage earners, or vice versa, rather, right? It was being shifted. That was 15 years ago, before this thing really ran out of control, right? So, yeah, it's there. People aren't aware how much there is, and it's not a lack of money. This country is not broke. It's just that increasingly it's been gathered in by the wealthy 1%, more and more for themselves, and they don't even report the full amount that they have. Okay, I guess that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jack Rasmus, for being with us today. Again, really appreciate every time you come on and engage in these discussions with us.
Well, let's do this in December after we see what that picture looks like.
Oh, geez. All right.
If you think my scenario is gloomy today, let's revisit it. I hope I'm wrong. I really do, but I don't think I am.